cloud before I forget. And somebody said that I'm getting terrible audio quality. Is it just me? Is it just Elizabeth? Okay, Elizabeth, I think it's just you. I'm sorry. All right, thank you so much. Um, so I'm gonna just share my screen a little bit because I thought it was so exciting that so many people were interested in this topic. So I'm just gonna go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Jelaine Fowlin, and I'm the Assistant Director in the Vanderbilt University Center for Teaching for Instructional Design. And today with me, we have Marshall Aiken, who is a professor of history. We also have Abby Parish, who's the associate professor in the School of Nursing. And we're so very happy that you've decided to join us. We're actually very delighted that so many people are interested in this topic. It just goes to show that this is not something that's unique to one institution, but it's a very pertinent topic. Started on Twitter, and look forward to there's a session that's coming up on Monday in our leading lines that talks about this as well. But though we don't have the capacity or time for full social presence, I just thought it would be pretty neat if I knew like where we all were coming from. And so I used the census region. Unfortunately, the South region was just too big for Mentimeter. So I had to separate it into three parts. And so it seemed as if most of us are coming from, well, I'm still waiting on a few people, and we're not going to wait the entire time. I'll probably just give 2 more minutes for people to respond. But it seems as if most of us are from the East and West Central. And then next is the West, and then Northeast. And we are so happy that we have people outside of the US. We are so privileged that you're here with us. And Ransford was saying that, oh, you Northeast people, you're coming up. Ransford was saying that we're so happy that we don't know what time zone you're in, but so happy that you are able to join us. So today, it will be a very collaborative discussion. We have Marshall and Abby, and they're just the starting point for this conversation. We by no means are assuming that they're the sole experts or proprietors of this information. Ransford will be helping me because we have so many people. He'll just randomly select a couple questions from the chat when the time allows, and then we'll have that discussion. So again, in the interest of time, I'm going to give 1 more minute to see which region is the winner, because I see people are still going on, and I won't stop the Mentimeter. I will just probably just exit out of it and stop sharing. All right. So another thing that I wanted to say as well is that the questions that I'll be asking Abby and Marshall are centered around giving you some background information about their course. I view this every conversation like qualitative research. You have to know the background in order to know, can I transfer this information or not? And then we'll have some questions about the design reconsideration. And then instructor scaffold, it's so very important. And like in higher ed, we all want to know, how do you evaluate? And that accountability, that's a kind of word that comes in because a lot of times busy work, accountability work sometimes get confused with busy work. And how do we make those necessary connections, especially with our formative? And as we move into an online space, we're thinking about those tools. And again, like with research, we can't only tell you the positive. Were there any limitations? Were there any challenges? And we always want to end on a good note. So we're going to ask them what was most fulfilling for them and any parting words of advice. And we'll try to move the conversation along that we'll be able to hear from some of our audience members. So it seems as if the East and West, South Central is still where we have most people coming from. And then we have the Northeast and West. So thank you so much. We know your time is valuable. And I'm going to stop sharing and get into the conversation. All right. So I'm going to start off with Abby. And can you briefly describe the course that you implemented meaningful asynchronous activities with? And after you've done that, can you tell us some of the design considerations that you had? Because I know your course wasn't a redesign, but it was a course that was already fully online.
Yeah, sure thing. So, hey everybody, I'm Abby Parish. I teach in the nursing department, and I teach the classes that are kind of known as the broccoli classes. So in nursing, the students are really excited for all the clinical courses, anything where they get to put their hands on somebody. But I teach in the master's program, the class that includes things like ethics and policy and evidence appraisal. And in the doctorate, I teach statistics. So these are classes that folks are less excited about. And I think particularly during the pandemic, my students and I, when we're not in the classroom, we're working with COVID patients and doing really serious stuff. So then when we're in the classroom, it is, I think, really easy for things to feel a little bit busier, right? Because they're not as deeply meaningful as some of the other activities we're engaged in. So as I approach design for these broccoli classes, as we call them, there are a lot of competencies from my national organizations that I am tasked with meeting. And so it's really a balancing act, I think, between making sure that the students get the competencies that a national organization wants them to have in an area that they're less excited about, and trying to be sure that it's really grounded in something that I can get them excited about. So how can I make those clinical connections to the content, but then also to the structure of the assignment? Can I, as I go along, be communicating to them why I think there's value in writing a paper or a short essay and that sort of thing. So kind of keeping both those pieces in mind.
Thank you so much for sharing, Abby. And I see that you've mentioned some of the motivational constructs as you think. I like the term broccoli, broccoli courses. And I know some of you do have these kind of broccoli courses, but how can you make it so that you have that relevance piece and that attention piece? I appreciate you sharing that motivational factor.
Mhm.
Marshall, how about you? We know you had a very the task of redesigning your course. So could you briefly state like what course it was and what were some of the major redesign consideration for asynchronous activities with that shift from fully face-to-face to online or blended? You're muted, Marshall. Sorry.
My course is completely different. I teach in the history department. The course I'm talking about is called Reform and Revolution in 20th Century Latin America, and it has about 28 students. It's a course I've taught about a dozen times over the years, never online. It has everything from freshmen through seniors. In fact, this semester, for whatever reasons, I had many more freshmen than I've ever had before. It's a course that's really aimed at, it's an elective class, so mine's not broccoli. They don't have, no, there's no reason for them to take it other than them selecting to come in. They know what they're getting when they come in. It's a class that really emphasizes writing. There are 2 5-page papers during the semester based primarily on the readings in the class. There are 2 5-page essay exams, and then there's a 10-page essay final exam. So there's a lot of writing stressed out through the semester. So my objective is get them to read, write, and have a conversation in class. The thing that was very different this time, when I teach this course normally, it is a mixture of lecture and conversation. Right, so some days are specifically set aside just for discussing the readings, but even during the week when it's the so-called lecture section, I move back and forth between talking for a little bit and then having a discussion and then back to lecture. So I didn't want to lecture online. So what I did is what's usually called the flipped classroom. I've never done this before. So I taped my lectures ahead of time, and I tape them in segments so that generally for any particular class, right, this is a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 50-minute segment class. I would have anywhere from 2 to 3 components, right, of lectures with somewhere between 8 to maybe 12 or 13 minutes for each component. So I posted these lectures ahead of time the way in the past they've had access to the readings ahead of time. So the big shift for me was to move from lecture / conversation in the classroom, and we just use those 50-minute segments, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, completely for discussion. And I'm the kind of person, I move a lot. When I'm in the classroom, I'm primarily moving around, trying to engage with the students. So the big difference for me this time was this Hollywood Squares stuff, right? And in particular, since I had slightly more than 25 people in the class, I can't see all of them on one screen at a time. So I'm constantly having to shift back and forth. So this was the big shift for me.
Thank you so much, Marshall. And one thing that you mentioned that I think is important to highlight is that your videos were in segments because sometimes when people record lectures, they'll probably do like 1 hour. And so a part of that engagement is that you made sure that it was in those segments and you integrated that asynchronous piece with your synchronous activity in class. So I appreciate you sharing that. And Marshall, you shared how many people were in your class. Abby, do you mind telling us how many people were in your class?
Yes. So in the School of Nursing, most of the classes, the students take them only with folks in their specialty. But the broccoli classes they take all together. So I have 400 in my class. It's the only class that they take as an enormous group like that. So it's a little different.
All right, thank you so much. We are gonna move on to instructor scaffold and communication. Communication is important in allowing students to see the value in learning activities. How did you communicate the importance of the activities so that students did not perceive them as busy work? You can go ahead, Abby.
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm seeing shouts to micro lectures in the chat. That's exactly what I use in my course. I tend to put a short lecture, its transcript, and the lecture as a podcast all sort of right there alongside one another so that students can consume it in whatever format they want. And in those lectures, I'm giving them content, but I'm also typically looking ahead to the assignment and talking about ways that the content will inform the assignment, but also ways that the assignment will be relevant in their future practice. So trying to find that task value for the professional activities that they'll engage in. Again, both making that link from the content, but then also to the format of the assignment as much as possible.
And Abby, do you mind sharing in a previous conversation? I recall you noting that even the way how we point to things in our navigation and things like that can inform students of the value of the assignment. Can you expand on that physical design as well?
Absolutely. So the way that I used to design my online courses was around sort of this index page. And I made the assumption that a student was going to start on a table of contents and kind of pop into something and then come back out to the table of contents and then pop into another thing and pop back out. And what I think that that creates for folks is almost like a busy work structure of in and out and in and out. And I think it also creates a very normal human impulse to go to the end and see, is there a way that I could just start here and work back just to find the pieces I need? I did an activity at the Vanderbilt Center for Teaching over the summer called the Course Design Institute. And they use this very different immersive design style where the first activity in the module, you kind of go in, and then for the rest of the module, you stay sort of underwater is kind of how it feels to me. You know, you're moving through with just sort of a forward air, a forward air, a forward air. And I think that it, you know, takes them down, gets them engaged, pulls them across all the way to that assignment, which I think really helps folks find meaning in the journey, more so than all the moving around I was having them do previously. I've noticed that students are much more likely to comment on the content, even in my course evaluations. I think they're much more engaged with those pieces now.
So that's amazing how learning has so many different elements. And sometimes as instructors, we tend to focus on the content, but even the design, especially as we shift to an online environment, really helps to affect. Because when we think about busy work, I want to emphasize that busy work is a perception. None of us intend to assign busy work. And so what we're doing in this conversation is saying, how do we handle that perception that all this work that you put into something meaningful, and a part of that is engaging in design. And a lot of us, since the online learning, have been talking about the community of inquiry framework and how by design can your teaching presence help so that people are not seeing this work as busy work. So I appreciate that point. How about you, Marshall? Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, in my course, it's essentially 5 case studies. So they take up about 2 weeks each. So part of the challenge, whether it's online or in person, is to constantly connect the readings, and now in this case, the taped lectures, with the discussions in class to guide the students towards each of those steps in writing. So part of the way the incentive, I guess you would say, to do the work, right, is they're each about every 4 weeks, building towards some sort of writing assignment where they're looking at one of these case studies or comparing two of them. So a lot of the conversation now in those 50-minute classes, which are entirely discussion, is drawing together what they've read, connecting that to what's in those taped lectures, but always building towards what's the next writing assignment and how to prepare their analysis so that they can do the best possible job in analyzing each of these cases.
That's amazing. And what you refer to is that link between the summative and the formative, which is also one way to help to avoid that busy work perception. And you just described remarkable instructor scaffold where everything is leading into the other. And again, the importance of linking the asynchronous, because everything that you did asynchronously was leading to something synchronously. And you did a remarkable job of tying it together. Almost see it almost like somebody who knits. And so through your, again, teaching presence, you were knitting that experience. So awesome. Abby, do you have anything to share or add to about how you make those connections between formative and summative?
Oh, I just lost it. I did have something. Come back to me.
I will. That's totally fine. It happens. And so, as you think about evaluation and accountability, how did you evaluate students and hold them accountable so they don't see activities as busy work?
I can answer the thing that I was just thinking of first, and then also talk about accountability and evaluation if you'd like. The thing that I had remembered, something that Cynthia Brame from the Center for Teaching shared with me a long time ago, was that it was okay to be transparent about my teaching decisions. And that blew my mind at the time. It felt like I was like pulling back the curtain on the Wizard of Oz, like, I can't tell them why I'm doing things. That ruins the illusion. But once I had that permission, it was so freeing. And I've found that it's so useful now. Now I tell them everything. I tell them every reason why I do everything. And I think it has helped the busy work dilemma so much because I'll explain to them, this could at first blush feel like busy work. Let me explain to you where I find the value, where I find the meaning, and why I've chosen this, and why I want you to meet me here and engage in this with me. When it comes to accountability and evaluation, probably the thing I've found to be the most useful is, the way I frame my feedback to students and the way that I can make it meaningful and make it conversational and have it be something that we can carry on together across the whole semester. And so let me clarify that in my class of 400 people, I have a lot of faculty that work with me and help me do a lot of this evaluation. But we try to use a format. Again, I've learned so much from the Center for Teaching. Thank you guys so much for all these sessions that you sponsor. But one that a lot of folks have mentioned, instead of a compliment sandwich, I like this idea of this is hard, you can do it, I love to watch you learn, and kind of embedding those principles in the way that I give feedback, I think has been really useful for keeping folks engaged and making it more relational across the semester.
Abby, where can our viewers or listeners find more information on the alternative form of feedback that you mentioned, or could you expand on that alternative form of feedback?
Yeah, well, I noticed that Derek Bruff is in the chat, so I'm hoping that he might be able to plug something in about that framework because he is one of the folks that originally exposed me to that. But the notion is that you wise feedback, he calls it. Oh, and it's on his blog. Thanks, Derek. So the notion is that you affirm for folks like, hey, this is a hard task. But then you also tell them, I know you can do this. And this is how, like, these are the steps, like, this is what I'd love to see you integrate on your next attempt. And then I also like to throw in just, I love to watch you learn. I think that really contributes to building a relationship. And that is the joy of my teaching, is watching people learn. And so again, I think it's just that transparency and letting folks know that that's why I do this, and this is delightful for me, and contributing that piece as well. So
thank you. I'm seeing the information in the chat, and I appreciate all the sharing of resources that are in the chat. And for those of you who are not aware, with Zoom, there's a feature at the end of the chat, and I'll try to save it and share the resources as well, where you can save the chat to see all these great resources that are sharing. But I will email those who registered, which you're here, so you registered, I will email you and share with that. And it's so important that you're talking about feedback and talking about learning, because there is a framework called Ghana 9 events, and it talks about learning guidance. And so I think a lot of it about the busy work is providing that feedback, but also providing learners with that guidance. Like Marshall, you're doing writing, and there's a certain way how writers think or have to process these challenges. And so having that scaffold, even in the way how we're thinking people learn our disciplines, is just super awesome. How about you, Marshall, in terms of anything else to add to the conversation about evaluation and accountability?
Yeah, I agree completely about the transparency. I would say that what I said to the students from the very beginning is like, there is a method to my madness in here. There is a reason I chose to do the course this way. If somebody else was teaching the same course, they would do it in a different way. And so the bigger picture, since most of them are not history majors, right? I have very few history majors in my class, is trying to emphasize them, trying to draw on their utilitarian sort of personalities, that ultimately what this is about is learning about 20th century Latin America, but what they're also going to develop are skills, right, that are transferable to whatever else they do, which is learning how to read critically and to write well, to communicate. So part of that is trying to emphasize that each of these steps, right, each of these assignments is developing those kinds of skills. And I would say in particular, I do two things. One is I make sure I get back the assignments quickly, right, which is a challenge when you're grading lots of written essays, right? So I will, of course, in the days of even before online teaching, right, to electronically be able to receive their papers, mark them up electronically, and send them back has been an enormous help. And then the second thing I do is I have a standard policy of what I call rewrites, right? After I've sent their papers back, they have up to a week, but only a week after they get those papers back, to meet with me now via Zoom, to talk through my comments on the paper, and then to revise it and rewrite it and send it back in. And I will regrade it and give them an average of the two grades. So from my perspective, it gets them to focus more on the writing and developing the skills. From their perspective, they have a chance to raise their grades. But the emphasis constantly, I try to say to them, look, I'm trying to not only teach you about 20th century Latin America, but help you develop these kinds of skills that are transferable.
That's amazing. I actually really like what you said, because I think sometimes as instructors, we are so buried in the domain or the exact content. Sometimes we forget the bigger transferable skills. And so that's super amazing, because whatever you teach them, it can be transferred. And sometimes that brings us back to the backward design process too, where we're focusing on the so what, like the overarching understandings. When you go somewhere else, it may not be 20th century history, it may not be diabetes, it may be something else. It may not be this patient, but when you're presented with something new, how can we think about those transferable skills? So that's amazing. Thank you so much. So speaking of that, you mentioned, Marshall, since you just spoke, that you used the online system to grade, which some people were using that before, but it seems as if that's something new. What are the tools that you found most effective in you achieving these asynchronous activities that were meaningful?
But in terms of grading, you mean?
Not necessarily grading, just you can tell me any tools that you use. I know for our audience at Vanderbilt, we have Brightspace, which is otherwise known as Desire to Learn. And so whether it's the tools in the learning management system or any other external tools.
Yeah, well, I use Brightspace, which is something I was using before this, but before it was largely a way in which they could have access 24/7 to all the information from the course, the syllabus. Of course, for us, it's also, well, there's never an excuse, oh, I didn't know, right? The students, right? So it's all posted up there. And I would say, in fact, what's happened now, what's shifted is, since I have a lot of readings in the class, part of this has been the incredible help of the library to make sure that those readings are in fact actually accessible to the students, right? And now via the Brightspace webpage, so that some of them can't buy them, copy them, whatever it is, but they're all then collected on this single webpage, right? The other thing that's been incredibly useful is the ability to tape my lectures and put them up there. And so I had always shown short video clips in my class, usually at the beginning of the class each time. So now I actually have all those on the Brightspace page along with the lectures. And that I actually wondered at one point whether it was even helpful for the students to have the lectures taped or whether it would have made more sense for me to just lecture in person. And on the evaluations for last semester, they said, no, they preferred to have those lectures because they could go through them at their own pace and in their own time. So, so that it turned out to work better than I'd expected.
Awesome. And shout out to our librarians for being so very helpful to us. How about you, Abby? What tools and Marshall, just a quick question. What did you use to do your recordings?
This was an experiment. So we have a small studio, right, where you walk in, there's somebody to help you get oriented. It's called One Button. And it literally is one button, right? Once it's set up, you push the button, it starts recording. You push the button, it stops recording, you download your lectures, right? We now actually have a second option. I tried out the other day. It's a slightly different one, but it's very simple. And then I tried Kaltura. So I said, let me do an experiment. And I used the Kaltura, which is basically you're voicing over PowerPoints. And after using both, I asked the students, which one do you prefer? Do you want to actually see me standing there? I look like the weatherman, right? The studio basically has a screen, right? You're pointed at the screen and you can move maybe 1 foot either direction. In Kaltura, all you're doing is listening to me watching the slides. The students preferred to have me standing there like the weatherman. So eventually that's what I did. All my lectures are in that one studio.
Awesome. I appreciate you sharing and that you decided to ask students for feedback. And sometimes when I want to do like very low videos, I actually just turn on Zoom and hit record to the cloud. And that's also one way. But we know we have Kaltura. There's also Panopto. And at Vanderbilt, we do have a one button studio. Thankful again to the CFT where we have our educational technologists, great people working there. Thank you so much. How about you, Abby? What tools did you use?
Yeah, I actually have a tendency to go pretty low tech, I guess. I use a lot of PowerPoint. I do a lot of voiceover PowerPoint. I have a tendency to write my entire script in advance and I write it in the notes section. And then I read it out loud with gusto. I've found that if I act really enthused in the PowerPoint voiceover, the students love that. I was kind of surprised, but that's been very popular. And so I, give it all I actually psych myself up. I say, I'm Robin Williams recording the voice of the genie before I record them, right? So I get like really animated. And then I print the slides and include the script that I used so that it's basically a transcript, which is great for accessibility. It's also, though, been something that my normally hearing students have really enjoyed to engage with. They've found that to be a preferable format for a lot of folks. And then, like I said, I also convert it to a podcast using iTunes. I mean, nothing high tech. I do my recordings typically in QuickTime only because I prefer to do the whole thing in one pass because I'm a perfectionist. And if I do it slide by slide, it actually takes longer. But so really tools that come standard on a typical machine. I'm not doing anything fancy, but it seems to work. So I think the multi-format is probably the most popular feature of my class.
That's amazing. And it's amazing that you mentioned about teacher enthusiasm, which is very important. And one thing that I've done when I'm consulting with faculty, even before I ask them about their course, I'll ask them, how do you feel about the content? Because believe it or not, there are times when you may be asked to teach a course that probably is not your best course, but it's a course in your major. And there are times when you're being asked to teach something that you're really, what I said, jazzed up about. And so how do you put yourself in that situation? Because connecting with yourself is super important because you're a part of that learning experience. And how can you pass that on to your students? And so somebody had a question that says, if you had the opportunity to record, you see? Okay, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I love this question. So about putting my image in the slides. So I discovered since I'm reading a pre-prepared script, it turned out not to be awesome. Like there wasn't really a great place I could put a script and make eye contact with the camera. That was not super easy for me. So what I've opted for instead is I make GIFs of myself and insert those in the lecture. So like I'll be, you know, at the end of every lecture, I'm waving goodbye. And like I do some other little stuff like that to try to infuse some presence into the material without actually having me on the screen the whole time.
That's a great and creative idea. And in our field, in instructional design, there is a researcher, Mayer, who actually does a lot of research on multimedia learning. And there is research that talks about what's really important is the dual channel, which is an audio and a visual. And he has found that having the presenter on the screen is not as effective as having that dual channel, which is the text that you have on the slide and your voice. I'm not sure if that research has changed, but that's one thing that when a lot of people ask about the person on the screen versus not. And so what he's emphasizing is that people learn better when they have that dual channel of the audio and the text. And so, yes. All right. GIF is such an amazing creative idea. Any other tools or anything else on tools? If not, we're moving on to tell us about what are the challenges you've encountered during the implementation and how did you resolve them? Either of you can start.
Okay, I'll go. So I would say one of the challenges is the same challenge you have with a regular classroom. How do you get students engaged? And in particular, how do you get engaged with what is asynchronous material even in a live classroom, right? And for a course like mine, how do you get them to do the readings, right? And speaking of busy work, there are ways you can come up with busy work to try and get them to do this, right? You can have pop quizzes, whatever, right? But interestingly, with the video version online, how do you get them to watch the lectures? And the interesting thing for me is you can actually track this, unlike the readings. You can see who is logged on to each of those lectures. You can't really tell how long they've watched it, right? Or how closely. But you do have a running sort of analysis of what's the participation rate in watching the lectures. And I have some colleagues who told me they did this last semester. They actually interspersed within those lectures quizzes, right? Polls, right? To guarantee that the students are watching and responding. Since I've never been a fan of this, I'm not doing it. My feeling is always like, if they want to do the work, they do the work. They're going to get better grades if they do the work. But it does mean that you have the same sort of problem with taped lectures as you have with normally assigned readings is how do you get the students to actually engage with that?
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that and also sharing one solution. And somebody just mentioned a tool about H5P interactive videos. And I think it also boils down to being transparent. Like you said, you were very transparent with the student that everything you do is contributing to their learning. And if they follow you, they'll be successful, which is one part. And then there are other pieces where you can embed the quizzes because a lot of times testing does increase retention. So apart from the fact that it's allowing you to see by virtue of them reflecting or testing, that retention will be increased. But for your situation, and I appreciate that you shared that that's not something that you're going to do, because that's what we want people to take away. Like we talk about tools, but we don't want you to feel, as a matter of fact, today, when we did our research, some of our students are inundated with tools. And Abby, you said, well, you're really low tech, which is fine because we want our viewers to think about what are the affordances that you want to maximize. It's not just about the bells and the whistles and how can you use it effectively. And you also want to be authentic to yourself. If embedding quizzes is not your thing, that's okay because you are achieving the outcome in another way. So I really appreciate you being very clear about what works with you and what doesn't, so our viewers can understand that you want to find something that suits you. How about you, Abby, in terms of challenges?
The challenge that I continuously face is, frankly, just the content. And I love the content. It's just really difficult to get a brand new student who wants to start IVs and touch people to get really excited about interpreting the confidence interval of a research study. That's just not what gets them up every morning. And I get that. And so I think certainly, I already mentioned task value, but we look for really creative ways to find task value. So a lot of times we'll try to find almost like when things have gone wrong. So like there are instances in our profession in healthcare where, international guidelines have followed evidence in a way that wasn't useful, right? That where the evidence said one thing and we kind of all misinterpreted it together and went in a direction that wasn't useful. And so finding those sorts of impactful examples can help, I think, highlight the value of, why appraisal is so important and why we need to be able to think for ourselves and read articles for ourselves. And so I think a lot of us just constantly having our ears open for across the profession and, what are the little opportunities to hook, to find those really interesting examples that we can bring into the class. And then somebody in the chat asked about sort of my metaphor about deep diving. And that was true, like purely navigational within our LMS. So I used to, in my module, you'd land in the module and there would be just a list of links and that would be all the content. And I had at the top sort of the first thing you came to was something that you could download and it kind of told you about everything you could expect in the module. The way that I reformatted, you land in the module, you see the title, you click the first button, and then in there is like everything you need, so that you don't ever have to go back to the main index page. You just hit forward and it takes you to the next thing, which this sounds so simple, but it was a total paradigm shift for my class and for the way that I frankly just kind of conceptualized my LMS. And I was shocked how much it seemed to change the way my students engaged. They'd been engaged in the chronological way that I'd been hoping for, and seemed to be more likely to find meaning in that space than they were when I had them kind of going in and out and in and out. It truly sounds so simple, but it really has been impactful for my class.
Thank you so much. Then, since you're talking, Abby, do you want to share with us what was most fulfilling and any parting words of advice?
Oh, man, I love online teaching. I find it very fulfilling. I enjoy all the preparation, and I enjoy the ways that I've come to experience students in that space. It was so different, and at first I so missed my former interactions, but I've gotten to know the students so well in this area now. And this year we inserted a little survey into our first quiz and just asked students to tell us about themselves. And man, I mean, just the things that they'll tell you. And then now as the semester progresses, as we see that people are having difficulties, we just refer back to that little question and we're like, oh yeah, well now I know what they're dealing with. It makes sense why I've kind of lost track of them. And so I think that I've been so pleasantly surprised by how much meaning there can be between humans, how humanized the online space can be when we bring those opportunities there. So.
And how about faculty members who are dealing with the pandemic, like faculty members who probably have never, because you used to teach online before, and so I feel you have that experience. And then anything to say to our colleagues who this is probably their second or third semester moving to online and they're faced with the complaints of busy work? Any advice for them? Not to put you on the spot, Abby.
Oh, sorry. I actually didn't know that question was for me. Could you actually pose it one more time? Sorry, I thought it was for Marshall.
Oh, no, you're fine, because I'm going to ask Marshall his question. I was just curious if you had any words of advice specifically for faculty who were transitioning, even though you'd never transition, but just anything for
Oh,
those
I did
faculty.
transition. Yeah, it was just several years ago. So I used to teach
Awesome.
in the classroom setting and then moved to the online setting. And I think that just like so many things in life, they're just two completely different things. And I think that when I brought my expectations for face-to-face learning into the online space, I would find myself disappointed. But when I've reframed and found the joy and the meaning in the online space and have brought that set of expectations, it just continually exceeds my expectations. And I don't think that my expectations in that space are lower. They're just totally different. I'm just looking for meaning in different places. I'm inviting meaning in different ways. But one thing is that in person, there was a lot of unequal interaction in a lot of ways. Like some students were going to be so much more likely to talk and engage. And in the online space, I've found such an even playing field in that way. I just think in terms of equity and accessibility, like the online space just has so much I can get really excited about. And again, totally different expectations, but really exciting, meaningful work there in my experience as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the idea of reframing. And so, Marshall, for you, what was most fulfilling and any parting words of advice?
I hate online teaching. Sorry. But that's because I'm spoiled. For decades, I've taught generally less than 50 students and mainly less than 30 students in a classroom. And I miss the engagement of being face to face, person to person. The interesting thing for me is the ironic thing for me is I actually think that my strongest asset in teaching is the ability to lecture. As much as I realize the inefficiency of that format, right? Which is why I didn't want to lecture online. But ironically, what's happened here is my guess is the thing I will probably change when I go back into the real classroom is I will probably start out at least and try. I will tape my lectures, right? So I won't lecture in the in-person classroom because it will allow me to then have a 50-minute conversation in the classroom, which I hope will be more fulfilling than having that 50-minute conversation online, which you get to see 28 different dorm rooms. Yeah, so I do think I may, when I go back, I'm assuming maybe by the fall we'll be back to some sort of normal behavior. I think I probably will start out by continuing to take my lectures and just use the 50 minutes on Monday, Wednesday, Friday for conversation.
I like that. Again, I appreciate your authenticity. And so we have a series that we started. I'm not sure if it's fully available yet, but called Never Going Back. And so I'm happy to hear about, even though your preference in teaching is with face to face, the few things that you're never going back. So this is the end of our sharing with our panelists. And we, perfect timing, because we wanted to allow a little bit of time for questions, but I just want to give Abby and Marshall an opportunity. Is there anything else you'd like to share that I didn't ask you? And then after that, I'm going to ask Ransford to just select one or two questions from the chat that we can engage with our panelists or with the entire audience that's here. And feel free to unmute after Ransford starts talking if there's something else that you want to add or in the chat as well.
I'll just
So
thank everybody for the awesome suggestions in the chat. I mean, I'm learning so much from the things in the chat. So I'll just thank all participants for the excellent sharing and insights.
thank you.
I would
Ransford?
just say,
Oh,
I would just say that before he comes, I would say that the Center for Teaching Online Course Design Institute was very useful before I did this. I'd used Brightspace and those sort of things before, but it reinforced to me what you mentioned before about the backward design model that I've used for a long time in my classes because of the Center for Teaching. And so it did make me really, once again, go back and pick apart the class I was teaching and ask myself, what was I trying to do to begin with and how does it look now? So that online course design institute was very useful.
and I know I'd seen somebody in the chat saying if there are any short courses. And so I know people are sharing resources. I know a lot of centers have been supporting this. And I think the big takeaway that I have gotten from both of you is that you kept mentioning the word, which again is in that Keller's model, where he talks about attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction. And then he added violation, which I spoke about in the blog post, but relevance just seems so key, and not only thinking about it relevantly, but making sure that learners pick up that relevance. So over to you, Ransford, if you want to select just a few things that have been happening in the chat, and the panelists can respond, or anybody from our audience can unmute your mic. This is a collaborative space for sharing.
Excellent. Thank you. I think the panelists responded to many of the questions that they were going. So I observed that Abby will go back to the chat to see questions, and then in her responses, she'll try to address that. But there was one specific that was talking about the DIY tools, and the question was, do you think your students' opinion will be different if you continue using the DIY tools to do live videos? And so I wanted who would take the stab on this.
I think it was Marshall. Was that question for Marshall? Where he was doing
so.
the stand-up videos.
I'm not sure I understood
the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was when Marsha was talking about adding images to her videos. And
oh, no, that's Abby. That's Abby.
Was it Abby? Yeah. And so one of the participants was asking that if you are using these tools, what do you think will be the opinions of your students? Do you think that they'll have different opinions as to the images you are using in your videos?
Did this turn out to actually be for me? Sorry.
Yes.
I was typing a response to another question. So this is about images and videos. Can you let me know who the person was and I can read the question? Sorry, I missed it.
I copied the question because a lot of conversations were going on.
I know, yes, so, definitely.
Let me.
Actually, I think Abby, you probably
you kind of responded
to it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You
responded, but.
Hi, I raised the question, so I can maybe try to reiterate it and give a little bit more context. So I understand, Marshall, that you had used your One Button Studios to record, and in comparison, you compared that to the videos that you recorded that were just the PowerPoints with your voice behind without you in them. And then Abby commented on her really great creative solution, which I like and will share, about she added some presence of including animated GIFs in her videos so that the students still see her and her face. So the question she answered in hers, she said that when she reads a script, it's really hard to read and look at the screen. But if you had the option, Marshall, to do your video comparison with your students with you in the One Button Studio as a weatherman as compared to having your PowerPoint with your slides, but with a picture of you talking through your slides, maybe not reading through them, do you think your students' responses in which they preferred would be different?
Don't know. Well, let me say this. I've been lecturing for a long time. And I actually have a couple of courses with a thing called Great Courses. And these are people who are trying to make money, right? So they know what sells, what people respond to. So what they do is they put you in a small studio. So it's a bigger, you have a few more feet to walk around, but it is very heavy on graphics as well. But their model, which is the one basically I do it in a very crude way in this One Button Studio, is to have a physical presence of the person there that you're watching as well as the graphics, right? And I strongly believe in this. I mean, let's face it, when you watch the news on TV, would you rather just see the weather map or would you want to see the weather person there at the same time? So I'm a strong believer in so I was glad the students reacted this way, right? Rather than just my voice. And I also have to say, I don't read PowerPoint slides. My PowerPoints are images and bullets, right? And I don't have a script for the lecture. I talk through it, right? So my guess is part of the reaction of the students is simply my style of lecturing is me conversing, right? Rather than reading from a script. So I actually prefer to have, I was surprised they said this. Because let's face it, the image is very crude. It's completely white behind you, right? And then you've got this sort of screen that you're slightly off to your left that you're pointing at. So it's very rudimentary.
Thank you so much. I think in the 10 minutes that we have left, there are two questions that came up in the chat. There's one that Derek posted, but there's also another person. So much is going on. I don't remember who it was. You can feel free to talk. Where you mentioned that your university prefers face-to-face, and so you're wondering about putting all this time. I attended a conference and somebody made mention of this pedagogy called resilient pedagogy, and What I asked us to think about is, as you think about your online learning and you're thinking about what are the elements that you'd never go back to when you do face to face, I would just suggest that we focus on those, especially if you're in a university where you feel like this work can be temporary. But as you think about that transition to face, like Marshall mentioned, that he would still use his video and flip. And so how would you do that? And then our other question is, which could be a debate, by Derek. And again, feel free to unmute your mics. Derek says, are we asking too much of our students in terms of asynchronous online activities during a pandemic? And there's a lot of discussion on Twitter where usually our formative assessments would happen in the classroom, but when they happen online, it's probably the same expectations. But do we have too much formative assessments? Do we need to rethink pedagogy in pandemic versus pedagogy when we're not in the pandemic? And so what are your thoughts, audience, panelists, anybody, in the remaining time that we have? We have 9 minutes.
So I can join the conversation. Brielle Harbin here. I teach at the Naval.
Thank you.
I teach at the Naval Academy now, but I actually was a GTF at Vanderbilt, got my PhD from the political science department. So I've been connected for a while. I think this is a really important question. I don't really actually know the answer to it because I feel like I'm still trying to figure it out. One thing that I have been thinking about, because I think there's a need to strike the balance of actually getting people to do the work, because otherwise we'll just come into the space and stare at one another, but be also compassionate too, both to my students and to myself when it comes to grading. One thing that I have been thinking about is what would be my learning goals in a non-pandemic, and then what will they look like in the context of this pandemic, living in a pandemic. So I'm prepping a new course for the spring, and I literally have 3 substantive learning objectives. And I find like it's the same learning objective, but I'm looking at it from different directions and going deeper rather than having a lot of range. I don't know how that will work. I think I'll feel like my students are learning less this semester, but I think that they'll have a deeper understanding, which I think is probably more of a transferable skill anyway, and something that will be more meaningful for their lives. But I literally have just been using note cards, wrote down my learning objectives. Every meeting has a different note card, and if it doesn't relate, then I'm throwing it out and thinking about how can I assess this in a way that's meaningful.
I like your analog approach to physically like sorting that type of thing. And in the blog post, I mentioned about a business term called minimum viable outcome. And I really like that you're thinking, if my students leave with nothing else this semester, is it better for me to decide on what you call those substantive pieces and focus on those, rather than in a pandemic when we know their capacity is smaller, even our capacity is smaller. And I always picture learners as like a bucket of water. Once that bucket is full, you could pour all you want. You're actually going to even achieve diminishing returns, because some of that water is going to come out as well. And so I really appreciate you sharing that approach. And so can we all think about what our minimum viable outcome is? It's not that you're reducing your standards, but what is a quality minimum viable outcome as we leave that's relevant to both you and the students? Go ahead, Brielle.
Yeah, can I say one short thing? That I actually had that blog post in front of me as I was working on my document. And so it was just so helpful. I think all of us who are revamping right now, if you just have that open side by side where you're working, it's just a reminder, is this too much? Let it go. It's okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Go
ahead, Marshall.
One of the things that's been different, that was different last semester, is any late penalty thing that I had in the past completely went out the window. The students' ability to keep up with the level of work compared to the past, for whatever reasons, right? Whether it's personal reasons, whether they're taking too much, whether this is more complicated. And I would say I learned very quickly last semester, was like, forget the late penalties, right? And so I had a more lenient approach to them turning the work in than I have ever had in my career.
And we're alluding to a term we have, but it's just for Vanderbilt people only, sorry, a session coming up about self-compassion. And I think that's something that we can all think about. And I don't remember who the researcher is I'm collaborating, but she views self-compassion as awareness, kindness, and common humanity. And I think that's something for us to think of. Be mindful of what's our capacity, be mindful of our students' capacity, and be mindful of how can we get that information. If we're not seeing that information, do we need to reach out and get that information? And then kindness is, what do you need? What do your students need? And realizing that it's not like you have a professor pandemic and a student pandemic. We're in it together. And how can you think about that? And compassion does not mean being lowering your standards or giving students a free reign. It just means deciding within this framework, where are your boundaries? And so thank you so much. We have 4 minutes left. I want to be respectful of your time and maximize our time. So audience members, feel free. It's open up to you if you want to talk or say something in the remaining time that we have. I hear somebody unmuting, but no talking. Thank you so much for sharing. Go ahead.
Hi, I just actually was curious to get your thought on a question that I asked previously. If you had a spare second, just to ask about how you improve student peer feedback quality asynchronously, to make sure that that feedback is useful and they can take it into, obviously if it's done formatively, into their further assessments.
I think some people gave responses, but we also have, and I'll try to remember it. We have a faculty member who does group. No, that's not it. For feedback, there's actually this technique that's called 2 C's, where you give a compliment, and there's like a structure to it. Sorry, I'm not remembering it right now, but I feel like with peer feedback, it's helpful when you give them that kind of structure and a guidance in terms of what meaningful feedback is, because sometimes they really don't know. And so giving them that kind of structure, I'm trying to see if I can find it very, very quickly. Let me look. Anybody in the audience have heard about that framework? I think it's called 2 C's or 3 C's or something like that. I think I can find it real quickly.
It's 3 C's, but I can't remember.
It's a really helpful framework for students' feedback. I think I can find it pretty quickly because I referred it to a faculty member recently. So I'm getting there. So it's actually called 3 C's and a Q. So compliment, I like; comment, I agree; connect, I've also seen; and then a question, I wonder why, who, what, where, and I will put where I got it from in the area. So it really provides a really good scaffold, because you're not just saying give feedback, you're actually giving them the words for that. So I actually like that framework. There are probably other frameworks, but I really like this one, and it's pretty easy to remember. So hope that's helpful. Does that help you?
Yes, very much. Thank you very much.
You are very welcome. We have 2 minutes. Anybody else wants to share anything? Maximize our time together, but also be respectful of your time.
I'll just ask one question. So one thing, we talked about scaffolding, which is something that I always do, but I found it a bit way harder to have students keep the thread in the remote learning context. And so I wonder if people have ideas besides just writing it down, because students aren't always reading that and understanding about how to reinforce scaffolding in different ways.
I'll give another super low tech idea. I pick a handful of concepts for my courses, and I pick an image to go with them. And then I flash that image pretty often through a number of lectures. So for instance, in statistics, one of my go-tos is trash in, trash out. So I have an icon of a trash can with a calculator in between and another trash can saying you can't magically make better using statistics if your methods to get the data were bad. And I'll just flash that all the time, as one of my low tech messages that I want them to hear over and over again. So, and I think also goes really well to your notion of picking these big ideas in the course. Like there's, I'm just like you, I've got this handful of things that are like so important to me. And so I pepper them over and over and over again and hope that some of those images, if nothing else, kind of seep in through the semester.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a good note to end with. I am going to stop the recording. Yes, I want it to